Now, with that said, I do want to stop putting words in the mouths of people living in Chicago and have you hear from them yourselves. So why don't we take a look at the first video and you'll kind of get a sense of where people are standing on the issue of crime.
Public safety is the #1 issue, and if we could address public safety, then we could address crime. For me, crime affects everything. It's the only issue that matters in this election. My brother was shot entering my freshman year of high school.
Her father, brother, and uncle have all been shot. One, she said, was mistaken identity. Another, a case of wrong place, wrong time. Many of those she grew up with have also been victims of gun violence.
I can count on more than both of my hands how many classmates have died, because it's more than 10. I literally dropped to the ground. I was laying on the sidewalk thinking, I don't want to be the next person on the news that's killed by a stray bullet.
Hogan is an attorney who lived in a North Side neighborhood for nearly 2 decades and saw it change after a family member was shot during a botched carjacking.
Get your Crispy, let's go.
Hogan and her 2 chocolate labs packed up and moved to a sleek neighborhood in the center of the city.
And what's interesting is the 2 women that you heard from in that video are wanting to tackle crime from different perspectives, okay? So one of them does not think that funding the police more, giving the police more power is going to really do anything to tackle the crime wave. The other woman, the one who actually moved with her labs, she says, well, police have low morale. We need to support them. We need to encourage them to do their jobs, not come down hard on them. So again, it's interesting because everyone seems to be concerned about the same thing. But based on what you hear from the electorate there, from the voters there are differences in how they want to tackle the issue. And the 2 remaining candidates who will face off in that runoff election represent the 2 different sides in regard to how to tackle crime. So really those 2 possibilities in tackling crime are on the ballot on April 4th. So with that said, I want a few more comments. I want to read a few more comments from people in Chicago, including Pilar, a 35-year-old who says that she's voting in a mayoral election for the first time since moving to the city 4 years ago. She said she's been frustrated by crime in her neighborhood, noting that she's witnessed 2 carjackings that took place in broad daylight. I can tell you that I've experienced that as well in Los Angeles, and it's beyond shocking. With shootings up in many Chicago neighborhoods, Vallas has capitalized on voters' feelings that Lightfoot's tenure has not made them safer. He has, by the way, he's also the only white person in the race. He's backed by the police union, Fraternal Order of Police. He has appealed to voters with a message largely centered on public safety and a plan to deploy hundreds more officers on Chicago streets. So look, Lori Lightfoot during this election, while campaigning, bragged about adding more cops to the police force, adding more funding to the police force. And that didn't do anything in lowering the crime rate. And it didn't do anything in changing the perception of rising crime among the voters. And I think part of the problem is the debate seems to center on whether or not you're funding the cops. And the real question should be, what are the strings attached? How is the money being allocated and for what programs? Is it for better training? I mean, just throwing money at the cops doesn't mean that you're gonna solve crime. How are those resources being used by the police department? What is being done in addition to bulking up the police force, I guess? Those are the questions that I feel like don't get answered, and it's an issue. And by the way, for the progressives who say we need to address root causes, great, what do you mean by that? Be specific. What specific policies are you pushing for that specifically deal with the root causes? Far too often I hear, we need to deal with the root causes, mental health, and okay, great, how are you gonna do it? Because simply saying it as a talking point isn't enough. We need to know exactly what you plan to do. What is the policy? Give us some details on that.
Let's talk a bit about crime and rioting. First, let's start with the demand for crime, and we're going to create a demand curve exactly the same way we created a demand curve for the city. Let's assume that everyone either commits one crime or doesn't, and that everyone has their own value of committing a crime. We'll order the people from those who like crime the most to people who like crime the least. We'll then get a series of bars representing the value that each person places on committing a crime. Those bars decline with the number of criminals precisely because we've ordered them in that way. And naturally, we're going to assume that the people who like committing crimes the most are the first people who commit crimes. Now, we do just what we did for cities. We assume thousands of people, and the bars start to get smaller and they smoosh together. eventually we're left with a downward sloping curve, which might be a line, but it also might bend a bit. The simple equilibrium equates this benefit of crime with the cost of crime. The easiest assumption is that the cost of crime is some function of the probability of arrest times the punishment if you are arrested. We can write this here as a horizontal line. This graph predicts that the number of criminals falls as the punishment for crime increases, or if the probability of arrest increases. But now, let's switch into riot gear. In riots, where there are really a lot of people breaking the law at any one time, the probability of arrest starts falling and eventually goes to zero. We'll capture this by assuming that first the cost of crime is a horizontal line, just like before, but then the cost starts dropping precipitously because the police are just overwhelmed. Eventually, because the probability of arrest goes to zero, the cost asymptotes to zero. As you can see, there are now 3 points where the two lines meet. A low crime point, which is normal times, a medium crime point, and a high crime big riot point. The medium crime point is again unstable. If you have a few more rioters, the benefit of rioting exceeds the cost of rioting, and so the size of the riot snowballs. If you have a few fewer rioters, the benefits of rioting are less than the cost of rioting, and so the size of the riot shrinks. There are two stable equilibria, one with a big riot, the other with normal levels of crime. How do you get from the low riot equilibrium to the high riot equilibrium? Some form of coordination device, usually. A mob massing for a sporting event or a protest. A true riot organizer. Maybe even just shared common expectations that a riot will occur. Twitter. How does a riot end? Usually by calling in the National Guard, which means a shift upward in the cost curve, first causing the riot to shrink and then precipitously to disappear entirely.
In the second episode, Does Crime Pay? Pauline, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So what's a nice French economist like you doing talking about crime? How did you get into it?
Well, I think I got into it because I moved to the US from, not directly from France, but from Europe at least. And I was very surprised by the difference in resolving disputes between people. So I don't know if you've been to France, and that's the reputation of French people, is that they shout, they insult each other, they're just generally rude.
But they don't shoot.
And when things become a bit too high, there's like, oh, I'm gonna call the police, and you'll be in trouble. If you move to the US and you have this sort of cultural background, you start beeping people, and then you realize that that's not a good idea.
No, they might shoot you.
Or shout at people, and that's not a good idea because they might shoot you.
Yeah, that's a worry. It's a bit of a disincentive, isn't it?
Yeah, and so I just thought that's very different, right? Because then people behave in a very different way. Yes. People seem a lot friendlier in the US because they never know whether you have a gun or not, or whether you're going to shoot them. And then, so it got me thinking about the relationship between the presence of the state and the strength of the state and the interpersonal violence. So what are the relationship between state development and state rule and interpersonal violence? So what kind of mechanisms people resort to in order to resolve disputes?
So is this observing behaviour, or do you think you can use the economic theory of incentives and disincentives to set up a model of crime in the US when you compare to, say, Europe?
Right, so exactly. So it got me thinking about, so first of all, why do disputes arise generally? And of course, this leads directly to the issue of property rights. Okay, so you have a resource and you want to defend that resource. You want to defend your property rights over that resource. And you really have two ways to do it. Either you hit anybody who's trying to steal it in the face and kill them, or you have policemen and a court system and the state that defends your property rights over that resource. And so you can imagine that in two different situations, in one situation where you have a very strong state in place, or a situation in which you have no strong state in place, no police, no court, the way people are going to defend their property rights are going to be very different. So the presence of the state is one thing, but then it's also culture. Right, so you can imagine that if there is no state in place at a certain point of time, which was the case in the West when mineral discoveries occurred, for example.
Wild West in California.
Right,
Yeah,
and Nevada, and even more the states that are west, but not along the coast, because they were even later in incorporating. So Wyoming, places like this.
Yes, sure.
So you can imagine that in these areas where there was no state and there was a large influx of people who were looking for natural resources and finding these natural resources, there was no state in place at that time to defend these resources. So they resorted to more violence. And then that in itself led to different institutional development than in the rest of the country, and also led to different cultural attitudes towards interpersonal violence. What you could observe, and I think a lot of my research shows that, is that crime may be paid 100 years ago, and then mother transmit these preferences to their children. And even if crime doesn't pay now, you still observe these things because people adjust their preferences more slowly than institutions can change. So you can still observe today that people display this sort of taste for violence, but it's not depending on economic conditions now, it's economic conditions that were in place 100 years ago, and people internalize, and they still teach their children to behave according to a certain way, even if it doesn't really pay anymore.
Well, thanks, Pauline. Look, I've been absolutely fascinated by your research, and good luck with your future endeavours. And anyone who thinks economics is about interest rates and inflation and it's boring stuff like that, I think you've really disproved them today.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.